about us and in our lives that aren't there yet.
I often get the question from the general public, how can I stop overthinking? You know, I have to imagine, based on the fact that I get that question so often, that there are a great number of people who sense their own generative drive. What are your thoughts on that?
Thinking can be wonderful if we're using thinking to learn, right? To figure things out. So when thinking is doing that, thinking is great. But a lot of thinking is just in the service of something else, right? And a lot of thinking works against us. So imagine the person making the garden, right? The person has to think about it. They have to think about what seeds to make. They have to think about where the tools are. They have to think about what they're doing, when they're planting, when they're watering. There's a lot to do, but the beauty of it isn't in the thinking, right? The thinking is in the service of what is generative, right? So that's a different kind. It's just thinking in the service of something, but a lot of our thinking is that, you know, it's planning, it's projecting. We tend to glorify the planning and the projecting, and it can be great when we're learning, when we're figuring things out. But a lot of that is there so that we can do the things that are good for us to do, right? The planning and the projecting around making the garden, where the point of it is the garden. It's not the thinking part, right? We can also use thinking against us. So much thinking is repetitive and not just unproductive, but harmful, right? That person who's looking out the window at the garden may be thinking. I mean, sometimes there are just pauses in our thinking, but you know, a lot of times a person must be thinking. And what often goes on there is just repetitive negative thinking. It's, you know, gosh, I used to have a garden. I remember when that was beautiful, or, you know, remember before such and such a person passed away and then we stopped making the garden, or I'll never be able to make a garden again, or gosh, it's too much. You know, it's just something that's negative and unproductive. I mean, what else is there to think? If the person's actually looking out the window at the garden, right, and they're in this sort of stuck state, they're not in a generative state, then the thinking becomes repetitive, and it furthers all the negative, right? As we said, the more we further the negative, the more we take. If there's a 4-lane highway that we want to atrophy, let's not make it into a 6-lane highway, you know. But we do that when we have this repetitive thinking, which then can evolve into the narratives, the things that we say to ourselves, right? So you know, thinking is wonderful. It's wonderful, but it can also just subserve something else, and it can also be used against us. So what we're talking about here doesn't glorify thinking. I mean, it does if it's in the service of the generative drive, but it doesn't in and of itself.
I think many people set a time, say, you know, 9:30 a.m. or 10 a.m. when they are going to begin doing something that they want to do or know they should do. That's a little bit challenging. Could be exercise, could be cognitively demanding work. And then 10 o'clock rolls around and they say, okay, 10:15. And they're distracted by often social media, texting. These days, I think those are the main culprits, really. I don't know too many people that get distracted by exercise and reading books. Some do, and doing complex puzzles or math. But you know, social media is a little bit like mental chewing gum, except that I would add to that that's the kind of chewing gum that really does sate the appetite in a way that prevents you from eating nutritious food, unless used correctly, right? And then people feel bad about themselves because the whole morning went by. Now it's noon, then they require some food like any typical person.
Right.
And they eat, then they might need a little nap for the postprandial dip in energy. Right. And then the afternoon, and then it goes on and on. I mean, I hear this all the time. I've experienced this before, so I'm not immune to this myself. That's why I try and capture that early wave of energy, whatever it might be, adrenaline, noradrenaline, some combination. The way you describe thinking and its potential relationship to generative drive, it seems to me it's so important that we capture those moments of potential creation, however small the action might be, to remind ourselves that we are capable of moving things from point A to point B. Because in the description I just gave of the person that lets the morning escape, there's really no external barrier except these distractions. Put differently, all the tools exist within most all of us to be able to create what we want to create, or at least to create something.
Right.
I mean,
right.
And yet many people just don't fulfill that that right that they were and that we've all been given.
Right. So let's think about what's going on there. Right? So the person says, I'm going to exercise at 10 o'clock. Right? Now they push it back to 10:15 and they do something on social media, or they